Theirs was a romance that blossomed in a fairy tale setting between a caring mother of two
Family was always her top priority.
and a handsome coworker that swept her off her feet.
He was the total package for her. She said, he just makes me feel like nobody ever made me feel before.
But a savage attack would plunge their lives into darkness.
This was one of the bloodiest and most horrific crime scenes that people could remember.
You wouldn't kill a dog in the way that she was killed.
Investigators would ultimately uncover a trail of violence and deception
It was shocking. I didn't know what to think at the time.
and leave everyone wondering, was this macabre execution the work of a sadistic stranger? Or was this monster a member of the victim's innermost circle?
There's this dark side of this guy that he's been hiding for years, and he released it in such a vicious way.
Saturday, January 17th, 2009, Niagara Falls, New York. The sun is dropping over this picturesque city, the self-proclaimed honeymoon capital of the world. But shortly after 5 p.m., emergency dispatchers receive a call from an apartment on the north end of town.
A man named Robert Johnson found his wife apparently dead on the kitchen floor of their apartment.
An officer is only blocks away when the call goes out from dispatch. He arrives within minutes, finds the front door open, and Robert Johnson cradling his wife in agony.
So what happened?
I don't know.
He was crying out to the police officers about the horrible discovery he just made. There was blood all over the floor.
She was stabbed multiple times.
In fact, some of the weapons used in the attack are still lodged in her body.
There were 2 knife blades broken off along the side of the torso.
I'm gonna need you to go ahead and stand up. So we don't need to clear. I need you to go ahead and stand up.
Within moments, other officers and paramedics arrive on the scene.
He was reacting so emotionally to having found his wife. Robert Johnson had to be pulled away from the body.
As Robert is dragged away, EMTs rush in to check Kenya's vitals, but there's nothing they can do.
They quickly pronounced Kenya Johnson dead at the scene.
Even for seasoned detectives, this homicide is beyond the pale.
The crime scene was gruesome. Her head was cut very severely to the point that it was almost a decapitation.
But as officers attempt to console a shell-shocked Robert Johnson, nobody can imagine how this 32-year-old wife and mother fell victim to such a chilling crime. Kenya Bashana Thornton, or Kenya as she was known, grew up in Niagara Falls, the second of 4 children.
Kenya, she was the quiet one. She was real reserved, and she was a homebody.
She didn't party, she didn't drink, she didn't smoke, really didn't go out to clubs.
But as Kenya grew up, this good girl discovered she had a weakness for bad boys.
She liked street guys that were like in the fast lane. Someone total opposite of who she was is what she attracted.
Kenya's first love definitely fit the bill. And at 23, she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Naomi. Although the relationship didn't last, Kenya worshipped her daughter.
Kenya was excited. She was happy to be having her first child.
In 2000, she landed a good job at a local call center.
Kenya made actually pretty good money there, doing customer service calls and whatnot.
While working at the call center, Kenya met a handsome, straight-laced coworker by the name of Robert Johnson.
How you doing today?
I'm good. You?
I'm all right. How was work?
It was good. I can't complain.
Though Robert wasn't cut from the brash, street-tough cloth that Kenya found so attractive, he made it abundantly clear that he wanted to be more than just friends.
He sent her flowers at work. Robert would send her candy.
You'll be available around Saturday night?
Yeah, I'm free Saturday night.
You sure?
Yes!
But Kenya was excited. Every time she see him, she told me she get butterflies in her stomach. She hasn't felt this way in so long. Like he'd kiss her, she just would float.
It wasn't just the way Robert treated Kenya that made her feel special. It was the way he treated her daughter, Naomi, too.
He was very accepting of her daughter that she already had. Robert loved her daughter just like he loved his own daughter.
Pretty soon, Robert and Kenya were inseparable. So much so that even when Kenya hit the town without Robert, she didn't stay out long.
We all got together and we went out. She left and went on her date with Robert. When you leave your girlfriends to go with a guy, then you're into the guy.
A couple months later, Kenya announced she was pregnant with Robert's child.
We told her, if you hadn't stayed with us, you wouldn't be heading this way, but it was a good thing for her.
By the winter of 2004, Kenya and Robert were raising two beautiful young daughters.
Kenya was so happy. She was such a good mother. Robert was just as happy. He was a very good father. He was very attentive. He helped Kenya.
A few weeks later, the couple officially tied the knot.
I'm home. Hey!
So that made me happy because I had someone who I knew was going to be taking care of Kenya, my niece, and so it was exciting to see the young love that they both had for one another.
The couple decided Kenya would stay home for a while to be with the children. And as they settled into their new apartment, Robert and Kenya seemed to be living a life of pure bliss.
She was pretty much at home all the time at that point, and he was at work all day. She was just so happy. I never saw Kenya happy like that.
But Kenya had no intention of remaining a stay-at-home mom forever. In 2007, she enrolled at Bryant and Stratton College in nearby Buffalo.
She was going to school to be a medical assistant.
She loved it. Kenya was doing great. Dean's List, great grades. Awesome grades.
As for Robert, he was also working hard. He'd recently taken a new job as a sales rep with a local cable company, which required him to log a lot of time on the road, which soon put a strain on their marriage.
So now the partnership with them, with the kids, and the workload and whatnot was kind of a little shaky then.
Things started looking up again in the fall of 2008, when Robert came home with some exciting news.
Sit down, I got a surprise for you.
No, I hate surprises.
You're gonna like this.
He told Kenya that there was an opportunity to move to Atlanta and get a job there.
According to Robert, the job would be better pay with better hours.
This caused us forced to relocate to Atlanta.
Shut up.
Yeah, so that means we gotta move to Atlanta.
To her friends, Kenya seemed ecstatic.
Told me they were moving. She was excited. I was happy for her. If it was going to work out and they were going to move away, then that was good.
A loving marriage, two beautiful children, a future full of promise. It seemed Robert and Kenya were well on the road to a long and happy life together.
Kenya!
Which made the grisly scene inside their home the night of January 17th all the more unthinkable.
People like a Kenya don't get murdered.
She would never do anything to hurt anybody. Who would do something to her like that?
If detectives are going to answer that question, they will need to unlock a vault filled with secrets. Secrets that would reveal this wasn't the first time a knife-wielding attacker had stormed into the Johnsons' home. Robert and Kenya Johnson began as co-workers and ended up as husband and wife. With two beautiful children and blossoming careers, their life seemed complete.
She told me, Robert, he just makes me feel like nobody ever made me feel before. And I'm like, I'm so happy for you. You finally found happiness.
But on January 17th, 2009, that happiness was torn asunder when Robert came home to find Kenya dead on the kitchen floor, her body riddled with stab wounds.
It was shocking. It was like unbelievable.
As first responders attempt to console a seemingly devastated Robert, investigators try to piece together what happened.
They counted 49 stab wounds in the body. Her throat had been cut basically from ear to ear. The police discovered that there were 3 knife blades stuck in the body of Kenya Johnson. And these knife blades had the handles broken off them, and broken knife handles were found at the scene.
As CSIs collect the knives and other physical evidence, news of this horrible tragedy spreads to the family.
It was devastating. I've never experienced that type of feeling or emotion that I experienced that day.
It was still like, this is not true. Somebody's gonna call us back and tell us that this is a terrible joke.
I'm trying to think who in the world would do something like this to this person.
It's the same question police are asking. They start by questioning the man who called 911, Kenya's beloved husband.
My name is Robert Johnson.
Robert, what happened today?
Went to the barber shop.
He explains that the couple was at home most of the day, preparing for a party to celebrate their big move to Atlanta.
The whole family gonna tell everybody?
Yes.
But according to Robert, the couple's daughters had a birthday party to attend as well.
I went to pick up the girls to bring them to the party because Kenya still had some running around to do before the party.
Robert says once the party preparation was over, he walked to the corner barbershop to get his hair cut. He returned an hour later, and that's when he found Kenya and called 911. To detectives, Robert seems to be telling the truth, and his story checks out with both Kenya's friends and the employees at the corner barbershop.
There was a very solid alibi. The barber said that he cut Robert's hair, nothing of note about Robert.
I felt bad for him. I thought this poor guy came in and found his wife dead on the floor.
With Robert eliminated as a suspect, detectives wonder what happened in that fateful hour Kenya was home alone. One possibility is that Kenya was somehow the victim of a robbery gone wrong.
You notice anything missing in the house?
I don't know. I didn't get a chance to look.
Police checked the apartment to see if there was any evidence of a burglary. They found there was no sign of forced entry and nothing appeared to be missing or out of place.
The lack of stolen goods suggests robbery might not be the motive. The same goes for the vicious nature of the attack itself.
This was one of the bloodiest and most horrific crime scenes that people could remember.
It was extremely violent because of the nature of the attack. It seems unusual that some stranger would walk in and just stab someone multiple times.
If the murder is personal, who's responsible? Shocked neighbors describe the Johnsons as a nice, quiet couple beloved by all. What's more, no one reports seeing or hearing anything suspicious that day. With the investigation going nowhere, detectives again turn to Robert in hopes he can identify someone who might want Kenya dead.
They decided to take him down to police headquarters where it would be quieter.
Once down at the station, investigators noticed something they overlooked earlier that afternoon at the scene.
What's up with the blood on your shirt?
It's from holding Kenya.
They noticed that there was blood on his clothing.
But it's not the only blood they see.
There were some small cuts on Robert Johnson's right hand.
On your hands?
This happened when I punched the rail and the police came.
So officer's gonna tell you what it needs to do, all right?
Sure.
Investigators ask him if he'd allow CSIs to take some samples for blood and DNA testing. Robert gladly agrees. As he's removing his clothes, investigators note even more blood.
A crime scene investigation officer noticed a spot of blood in the center of Robert's chest.
Robert gives police his consent to collect a sample of the blood. Detectives send the sample and Robert's bloody clothes to the crime lab for analysis. Robert also volunteers to give police his and Kenya's cell phones.
He was cooperative with them the entire time he was there.
But in order to determine who might want Kenya dead, detectives had to ask some difficult and deeply personal questions.
Now, Robert, neither one of y'all were having an affair.
No.
Robert describes a happy, healthy, and faithful marriage.
Well, help me out. Tell me who done this.
And that's when Robert gives police their first break.
I kind of got an idea.
Robert recounts a frightening ordeal that happened several months earlier when he was home alone with the kids.
Ain't no drugs in here, man. What is y'all doing? There ain't no drugs. Ain't no drugs.
Just 3 months before the homicide, there was a robbery and a home invasion at the Johnson home. Robert was home.
2 guys with black hooded sweatshirts rushed in the house, and they made all the kids get in the closet. They told the kids, if you come out the closet, we're gonna kill you.
Come on, man. Yeah.
Robert says the attackers demanded drugs.
He suspected the perpetrators had reason to believe that Mrs. Johnson's cousin, who lives across the street, might have some of his stash.
Robert tells police that when he explained to the attackers that there were no drugs in the house, one of the men attacked him. And though his injuries weren't fatal, they did leave scars.
There were scratches on his back because the intruders had knives.
Not only are the knives Robert describes similar to the ones used in the attack on Kenya, a police report verifies his account of the assault. Unfortunately, no arrests were ever made.
That crime kind of went by the wayside and went unsolved.
Is it possible that Robert's assailants had returned in search of drugs again?
Someone may have been storing drugs in the house, and that may have been what the intruders were looking for.
I'll give you my card. If you have any questions, you give us a call, okay? No matter how small you think it might be, all right?
They questioned him there for 3 hours before letting him go. It seemed like they were considering him to be a shocked husband who had discovered a horrible crime had been committed against his wife.
But as detectives begin hunting down these mysterious home invaders, evidence will surface that steers them in a different direction and exposes the details of a forbidden relationship, one so tawdry nobody in the Johnsons' inner circle could have ever seen coming.
Shocking. Still disbelief to this day. Still can't believe what happened.
Police in Niagara Falls are struggling to solve a shocking murder. Kenya Johnson was stabbed nearly 50 times and left for dead in the home she shared with her husband and 2 young daughters.
The crime scene was gruesome.
Who could do this?
Kenya's husband Robert has just informed police of a violent home invasion that took place at their apartment 3 months prior to the murder.
Ain't no drug. Ain't no drug. Get the girls, man.
Someone had broken into the house and made the kids get into the closet.
The similarities between this attack and the attack on Kenya are undeniable.
Or 2 robbers came in and tried to look for some drugs and knives.
And based on Robert's statement, they appear to have been carried out by drug dealers targeting the wrong residents.
That's all I heard. Like, there was a cousin of hers that had a stash.
Maybe someone was targeting this home for whatever reason. They tried back in October, and then they thought when Robert leaves to get his hair cut that they've got free reign in the home, and then they're shocked when someone's in there, and that was a Kenya in there.
So tell me about Kenya.
Looking for answers, police track down Kenya's cousin and question him about his involvement with drugs. He denies the allegations and claims to have no knowledge of the identity of the assailants.
Any of that stuff going on in the neighborhood?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I'm hearing every day, and I don't see anything out of the ordinary.
As for any potential involvement in drugs on Kenya's part, friends and family are skeptical.
To think that this could have been done to her by a drug dealer, it just didn't match. Kenya didn't have those kinds of enemies. She was not ever involved in a lifestyle of drugs.
Investigators are having a hard time connecting the dots. But if drug dealers aren't to blame, who is?
Nobody goes and kills somebody that they don't know and stab them that many times. And the knife blades and the neck thing and all that, this was personal.
Detectives dig deeper into Kenya's personal life, hoping to find something, anything that will help unravel this mystery. They reach out to Kenya's older sister, Africa.
Can you describe your relationship with your sister?
We were close.
She knew Kenya like no other.
Kenya would, tell me everything. I mean, everything. I talked to her every single day on the phone, 2, 3, 4 times a day.
And as Africa recalls some of those conversations, a new person of interest begins to emerge. A former boyfriend named Letario Humphrey. According to Africa, much like many of Kenya's previous suitors, Letario was a bit rough around the edges.
Did Kenya like street guys?
Kinda like street guys, yeah. Bad boys. Letario, he was like a street guy as well.
While dating Kenya back in 2002, Letario was arrested and sent to prison for drugs.
Their relationship kind of fizzled off after he went to jail.
Even though Kenya had been with Robert ever since, she kept Letario in her heart. And when he was released from prison 5 months prior, in September 2008, Kenya paid Letario a visit.
She said they had went out to lunch a few times, her and Letario.
But were Kenya and Letario having more than just lunch? According to Africa, that was the rumor, at least among Kenya's girlfriends.
And it wasn't shocking because I knew that Letario still had feelings for her, Kenya.
However, Kenya's sister isn't so sure these rumors are true.
Well, her friends used to play around about them having a relationship.
He was kind of like her confidant. She said, Africa, he's just somebody that listens to me and we talk to each other. She never, ever said to me that they started sleeping together again, but is it possible? Yes.
For investigators, Africa's statement triggers a new theory. Is it possible that Kenya cheated on Robert with Letario, only to put the brakes on the affair once it became clear that she and Robert would soon be moving to Atlanta? And did Letario decide that if he couldn't have Kenya, nobody could? Detectives track down Letario Humphrey and bring him in for questioning.
Did you sleep with her? She came over a couple times. Did you sleep with her? Yes, I slept with her.
He was freed from prison on September 10th, 2008, and told the police that very soon after that, he resumed his relationship with Kenya Johnson.
He was there for her, talked to her. He just made her happy.
Detectives press Letario about Kenya's murder, but Letario's adamant he had nothing to do with his lover's brutal death.
So let me tell you this, you had nothing to do with that, is that what you're saying?
I had nothing to do with it, man. That's crazy if you think I did. I loved her.
Given Letario's lengthy criminal history, detectives are skeptical.
He had served prison time. He had several drug convictions. He was recently released from prison.
But without any hard evidence, investigators have no choice but to release him and turn back to Kenya's sister Africa for more intel on Letario, who makes another startling revelation.
Robert had access to Kenya's phone, and she did tell me a while back that he found some text messages.
Text messages that demonstrated just how close Kenya and Letario still were. Kenya then informed Robert that she and the kids wouldn't be making the move to Atlanta with him, and that the going away party she was planning was only for him.
She was not going. She was staying here in the city.
It would be much easier for her to break away from him once he was out of the picture or out of the city.
Investigators are floored. By all accounts, Kenya and Robert seemed like they had the perfect marriage. But Africa informs them that the marriage was broken long before Letario came back into the picture.
Kenya and Robert's relationship, I think it started to go bad before Letario came home from jail. They just were having problems in their relationship.
In fact, Kenya had secretly complained to her for years that she was unhappy with Robert and that they were no longer intimate.
No, he was even sleeping in his bedroom.
Kenya had told Robert, I don't think this is gonna work. I just don't want to be with you anymore.
An alleged affair, a rocky marriage, plans for a separation. Africa's statement is a stark contrast to the picture Robert Johnson described to police. Investigators can't help but wonder what other information is Robert Johnson hiding. But in an effort to learn the whole truth, detectives will unearth more lies and make another shocking discovery. Kenya wasn't the only one hiding a secret love affair.
We didn't know who she was. We didn't know anything about her. We just knew that it was another woman.
It's now been more than 48 hours since 32-year-old Kenya Johnson was found brutally stabbed to death in her kitchen. On the surface, it seems Kenya and her husband Robert were the perfect couple. But new information suggests the marriage was in trouble, and Kenya was having an affair with an old flame.
Kenya was reportedly having an affair with a man named Letario Humphrey, who was a former boyfriend of hers.
Not only was Kenya allegedly having an affair, but contrary to what Robert originally told police, her husband seemed to know all about it. Detectives now believe this knowledge might just be a motive for murder.
The homicide may have resulted in part from Robert's jealousy over Kenya's relationship with Letario Humphrey.
There's just one problem with that theory: Robert's airtight alibi.
There was a barber shop near the Jordan Gardens apartment, and the barber, Fred Gilmer, said that Robert Johnson arrived in his barber shop to get his hair cut.
We need to find out this number, this 555-1969. It shows up a lot on his records.
Detectives decide to take a look at Robert's cell phone, which he gave police on the night of the murder.
When you get the phone.
At first, nothing seems out of the ordinary. But as investigators pour through the records, something jumps out. On the morning of the murder, Robert was communicating with somebody listed as my wifey. But it wasn't Kenya's number.
Robert was having contact via text message and phone call with the other woman.
I was like really shocked. Like, oh my God.
Who was this woman? And why was Robert referring to her as his wifey? A search of records indicates the phone number belongs to a woman named Lakeisha Davis. And when detectives learn Lakeisha is working at a fast food restaurant in nearby Buffalo...
Lakeisha? Hey, what if I can talk to you through this man? I'm Investigator Davis, Investigator Clemens. Have a seat right over here.
Good. They decide to drop in for a surprise visit. Detectives ask Lakeisha how she knows Robert. What she tells them is jaw-dropping.
Do you know Robert Johnson?
Of course, he's my fiancé.
We found out that Robert had a whole fiancé. He was engaged to somebody else. He brought her a ring and everything.
We found out Robert was, I guess, seeing another girl. I was shocked. I thought they loved each other, that Kenya and Robert had a loving relationship.
While it's certainly shocking, news of Robert's engagement to Lakeisha Davis seems to undermine the theory that Robert murdered Kenya in a fit of jealousy.
If you find out your spouse is having an affair, but you're having one also, I think that cuts against any rage motive.
But what about Robert's new fiancée, Lakeisha Davis? Could she have found out about Kenya and murdered her in order to get rid of the competition?
You see love turn into murder. The people who do this have a very unusual way of showing love. They try to get the person all to themselves. They don't want to share them with anybody else, and things turn violent very easily.
But Lakeisha Davis has an airtight alibi as well.
Where were you on Saturday, the 17th?
Saturday the 17th. Actually, I was here working because I worked the weekends.
And not long after confirming Lakeisha's alibi, police receive a forensic report from their CSI team.
The police officers found blood in a number of different locations in the apartment. One of them was on the wall of a staircase.
In addition to the staircase, CSIs have also discovered additional blood evidence in a downstairs washroom.
What they found was when they tested for DNA inside the sink trap in the wash basin, they found a Kenya Johnson's DNA.
The CSI team also recovered one more murder weapon.
They found another bloody knife that was bent inside a kitchen drawer of the apartment.
The additional murder weapon and the new blood evidence in the sink suggests someone tried to clean up the crime scene. But the most critical evidence from the CSI report is the DNA test from the blood sample taken from Robert's chest.
And it matched to Kenya's blood.
Robert initially told police that it was his blood from a scrape he sustained moving furniture. If he was innocent of Kenya's murder, why would he lie? To answer that question, detectives bring Robert in for another interview.
Tell me the truth. What happened to Kenya? What you mean tell you the truth? I've been telling you the truth.
They said they wanted to ask him some more questions. And in the course of a 2-hour interview, they ended up basically accusing him of killing his wife.
It's on you. We got her DNA off you.
Robert sticks to his original story, that he was at the barber shop at the time of the crime. Though there are eyewitness accounts corroborating that statement, detectives know physical evidence doesn't lie. They begin grilling Robert about the knife CSIs have recovered from the drawer.
Why would the killer put the knife in the drawer?
I don't know.
They wanted to know why a burglar, if that's who killed a Kenya Johnson, would put the murder weapon back in a drawer. Johnson replied, I don't know. A dumb one?
Enough of this. Robert Johnson, you're under arrest for the murder of Kenya Johnson. Stand up.
It's not the answer investigators are looking for. So on February 17th, nearly a month after investigators encountered a tearful Robert Johnson, cradling the blood-soaked body of his slain wife, he is officially charged with murder. Kenya's friends and family are blown away.
Everything is running through my head. Everything is like, why? How come? Why would he do this to her?
I'm shocked. It was a disturbing, confusing time. He's still the husband of my niece. And in that moment, you want to believe that there's no way he could have done this.
But as the tawdry details of this case emerge, the blood evidence, the affairs, that shock turns to rage.
I'm literally thinking about Kenya in that moment and saying to myself, it's going to be okay. Justice, we're going to get justice for you.
But getting justice for Kenya won't be easy. And when the case goes to trial, the defense will play a trump card that will rock the courtroom and beg the question, is the wrong man on trial for Kenya Johnson's murder? Niagara Falls, New York is described as a lover's paradise. But on January 17, 2009, it became the scene to one of a gruesome crime. Kenya Johnson, wife and mother of 2 beautiful daughters, was stabbed 49 times and nearly decapitated in the kitchen of her apartment.
It was shocking. I mean, you lose people in your life every day, but never would I thought that it would be like this.
After a lengthy investigation, police have charged Kenya's husband, Robert, with the murder. But as the case heads to trial, Robert remains adamant that detectives have charged the wrong man with murder.
He said, I didn't do this to her, Africa. I promise you I didn't. I said, well, Robert, I must be honest with you. I believe you did it. I do. And justice will prevail.
On September 22, 2009, opening arguments begin. Prosecutors start by laying out their theory about what happened. They assert that even though Robert was carrying on an illicit affair of his own, when he discovered his wife was cheating on him and that she no longer planned to join him in Atlanta, he snapped.
What you mean you can't go to Atlanta?
I'm tired.
You tired of what? Cheating on me?
Cheating on you?
Yeah, right? How long you been sleeping with her?
What are you talking about?
She may have said, I am cheating on you and I don't want to be with you, or said something to Bruce's ego and he lost it.
Prosecutors claim that Robert grabbed a set of knives and began viciously stabbing Kenya over and over, 49 times in all, leaving several broken blades in her body.
There's a lot of jealousy, a lot of rage.
And Robert Johnson wanted, in effect, revenge for his wife cheating on him and for, in his opinion, not really loving him all these years.
According to prosecutors, once Robert realized Kenya was dead, he headed to the basement and attempted to wash away the blood. While doing so, Robert realized he needed an alibi, so he changed clothes and made a mad dash to the corner barbershop.
It's crazy. You can't possibly be in your right mind to murder someone, clean yourself up, leave the house, leave the person there, and go get a haircut.
After his haircut, Robert returned home, called 911, and then cradled his wife's body in his arms until police and EMTs arrived.
Prosecutor Lisa Berry told the jury he had to come up with an alibi, and he had to come up with one in a hurry.
I believe wholeheartedly that he's done this. It was clear to us more then, as she laid it out to us, exactly kind of what took place.
When it's his turn, Robert's defense attorney, Michael McNellis, argues that the real guilty party is the Niagara Falls police, who in their rush to judgment arrested an innocent man.
The police honed in on Robert Johnson right off the bat and never looked anywhere else.
McNellis also argues that Robert's barbershop alibi is indeed airtight, and that his client never had the opportunity to kill his wife. As proof, they offer the testimony of the barber, Fred Gilmer.
Gilmer said that Johnson arrived in his barbershop and waited 15 minutes and then had about 20 minutes in the chair for the haircut.
The mathematics of the time doesn't comport with Robert being the killer.
Prosecutors counter by asserting the walk from the Johnson residence to the barbershop doesn't take nearly as long as the defense suggests.
The barbershop is only 2 or 3 blocks from the apartment where the Johnsons lived.
But according to prosecutors, more important than a timeline is the fact that Kenya's blood and DNA was found on Robert's clothes and body, as well as in the basement sink.
By the time all the evidence came out, there was no way. Everyone believed that he did it.
Defense attorney McNellis counters that the DNA on Robert's chest and clothes were transferred when he was tearfully cradling his wife's blood-soaked body. He also provides a possible explanation for the evidence found in the downstairs sink basin.
There was the washing machine that was washing right into that sink basin. So as people's clothes are washed, there's traces of DNA that can spill into that sink trap.
That's when defense attorney McNellis drops a forensic bombshell and introduces evidence he feels proves his client's innocence: the socks Robert was wearing the day of the crime.
Among the items of clothing the police took from Robert Johnson was his socks. Those socks were later tested for DNA, and they found a Kenya Johnson's DNA and Robert Johnson's DNA, and the DNA of a third person whom they were unable to identify.
There is a third DNA profile that, to me, was picked up when Robert's walking through the blood.
McNellis contends that the unknown DNA belongs to the real killer, one of the intruders who first attacked Robert months earlier. It's an argument that seems to plant the seed of reasonable doubt.
They did try to paint the picture there could have been a third person there. You want to give everybody the benefit of a doubt.
On October 5th, 2009, both sides rest their case. 3 hours later, the jury announces they've reached a verdict.
Robert had no emotion. He just sat there.
I really believe that Robert's going to get his just due in the end.
The 4 men and 8 women find Robert Johnson guilty of first-degree murder.
It was like this sigh of relief came over me. He's gonna go to jail now. He's gonna get, what he deserves.
We may not ever have a Kenya with us again, but at least we have justice for her murder.
The judge gives Robert a sentence of 25 years to life. But before Kenya's family can feel even an ounce of victory, the case is rocked by another bombshell. One that suggests the guilty verdict just handed down is far from a sure thing. The roller coaster trial of Robert Johnson for the murder of his wife Kenya has just ended with a guilty verdict and a sentence of 25 years to life.
So we're standing there and we're listening, and when we hear that verdict come back as guilty, part of you wants to rejoice because he is found guilty. Justice is being served.
But the celebration is short-lived. Not long after the verdict is read, Robert's defense attorney, Michael McNellis, files an appeal, claiming he now has proof that his client is innocent.
McNellis said that he had an affidavit from a teenager named Robert Thousand, who had been an inmate in the Niagara County Jail. Thousand wrote in his affidavit that another inmate by the name of Thomas Pryor had confessed to killing a Kenya Johnson.
Moreover, Thomas Pryor is revealed to have been one of the suspects initially investigated in the home invasion that occurred at the Johnson residence 3 months prior to the murder.
I asked the judge basically to throw out the verdict, reopen the case, and start all over.
Kenya's family is in utter disbelief.
I don't know really how to respond, and so I'm shocked. I'm shocked.
On February 17, 2010, the judge calls a special hearing to determine if Robert Thousand is a credible witness.
He took the stand and verified everything that he said in the letter. He maintained all the way through that Thomas Pryor's words were that Thomas Pryor went in and committed the crime.
But when pressed, Robert Thousand is unable to provide any additional details about Thomas Pryor or the murder of Kenya Johnson. In short, the judge isn't buying it.
The judge didn't believe that Robert Thousand's information was credible. That was his assessment.
The judge said both his body language and his intonation gave him away as a liar.
On May 22, 2010, the court upholds Robert Johnson's guilty verdict and his sentence of 25 years to life. For Kenya's family, it's a bittersweet victory.
My friend's gone. Africa's sister's gone.
June 1970. Winter had settled over the rolling farmland of Pukekawa like a heavy grey blanket. The hills of rural New Zealand stretched into the distance, quiet and endless beneath low clouds that seemed to hang only a few feet above the earth. At night, darkness arrived early here. It swallowed the narrow roads, the fence lines, the clusters of trees standing alone against the horizon. After sunset, the countryside belonged to silence. Or at least, that was how it appeared. Because sometimes the most terrifying crimes are not born in dark alleyways or violent neighborhoods. They emerge from places where everyone knows everyone else. Places where doors are left unlocked. Places where neighbors wave from tractors and children grow up believing the world is safe. Places exactly like Pukekowa. Long before the headlines. Long before the investigations, the accusations, the courtrooms, and the scandals that would shake an entire nation, there was simply a farmhouse standing among the fields. A modest home. A young family. And a secret hidden somewhere in the darkness. For more than half a century, people have searched for the answer. Who killed Harvey and Jeanette Crew? Who entered that isolated farmhouse and turned an ordinary winter night into one of New Zealand's most haunting mysteries? And perhaps even more disturbing, did the real killer ever pay for the crime? Because this story is not only about murder. It is a story about suspicion. About betrayal. About evidence that should never have existed. About a man condemned by the justice system and later declared innocent. And about a little girl left alone in a house that had become a crime scene before anyone even realized a crime had occurred. The official records contain names, dates, witness statements, and forensic reports. But behind every document is a moment. A moment when somebody made a decision. A moment when somebody pulled a trigger. A moment when two lives ended. And a moment when the truth began to disappear. The landscape of Pukekowa has changed over the decades, but not enough to erase the past. Even today, when the wind moves through the fields, when fog drifts across the roads before sunrise, it is easy to imagine the place as it was in 1970. A farming district far removed from the noise of the cities. The kind of community where unusual events traveled quickly. Where strangers were noticed. Where a murder seemed almost impossible. That belief would not survive the winter. The first thing that makes this case so unsettling is how ordinary everything appeared at the beginning. There was no warning. No obvious threat. No dramatic confrontation witnessed by neighbors. No screams reported in the night. If there was fear inside that farmhouse during those final moments, it remained trapped within its walls. Outside, life continued as normal. Cars passed along country roads. Farmers attended to livestock. Families gathered for meals. The world kept moving. And yet, somewhere among those quiet hills, a deadly act had already taken place. An act so shocking that it would eventually become one of the most infamous criminal cases in New Zealand history. The mystery deepens because the murders themselves were only the beginning. In many true crime cases, investigators identify a suspect, gather evidence, secure a conviction, and close the file. Not here. This case refused to stay simple. Every answer created another question. Every conclusion seemed to uncover another layer of uncertainty. The deeper authorities dug, the stranger the story became. Years later, people would debate not only who committed the murders, but whether the investigation itself had become corrupted. Whether the pursuit of justice had transformed into something else entirely. Whether the truth had been buried alongside crucial evidence. But all of that was still in the future. In the beginning, there was only a disappearance. A silence. A growing sense that something was wrong. Imagine standing outside a farmhouse in the middle of winter. The air is cold enough to sting your face. The fields are damp from recent rain. The sky is the color of steel. Nothing appears unusual. No broken windows. No overturned furniture visible from outside. No sign of violence. Just another rural home. Yet inside, hidden from view, were clues pointing toward a horrifying reality. A reality nobody could yet comprehend. The coming weeks would reveal fragments of a nightmare. A bloodstain here. A missing person there. Questions with no answers. Rumors spreading through the community. People lowering their voices whenever the case was mentioned. Parents glancing toward their children and holding them a little closer. Because crimes like this do more than take lives. They destroy certainty. They force ordinary people to confront a frightening possibility. If something this terrible can happen here, then where can it not happen? The fear spread far beyond one family. It reached into neighboring homes, into police stations, into newspapers, into courtrooms, and eventually into the national consciousness of New Zealand itself. The murder of Harvey and Jeanette Crew would become more than a criminal investigation. It would become a symbol of unanswered questions, a symbol of doubt, a symbol of how fragile truth can be when powerful institutions become involved. Yet before the controversy, before the accusations of fabricated evidence, before the public outrage and political pressure, there were two human beings. A husband. A wife. People with routines, plans, hopes, and ordinary concerns. People who expected to wake up the next morning. People who had no way of knowing that their names would one day be remembered across an entire country. And perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of all was waiting silently in a small room inside that farmhouse. A child. Too young to understand what had happened. Too young to know why her parents never came back. Too young to explain anything investigators desperately wanted to know. As adults argued over evidence and theories, as lawyers battled in courtrooms, as journalists chased leads and detectives reviewed files, that child remained at the center of the story. A living reminder of what had been lost. A witness without memories. A survivor without answers. Even now, decades later, the case continues to cast a long shadow. New generations discover the story and find themselves drawn into the same mystery that captivated investigators half a century ago. The names change. The theories change. The technology changes. But the central question remains exactly where it was in 1970. Who did this? Who entered that house? Who decided that Harvey and Jeanette Crew would not survive the night? And why? Some mysteries fade with time. Witnesses die. Evidence deteriorates. Public interest disappears. This one refused to vanish. Because every attempt to solve it seemed to reveal another contradiction. Every certainty eventually became uncertain. Every official version of events faced scrutiny. The result is a case that exists in a strange space between history and legend. A crime documented in records yet surrounded by endless speculation. A murder investigation that became a national controversy. A search for justice that left many people wondering whether justice had ever truly been found. Tonight, we return to the beginning. To the cold winter fields of Pukekohe. To a farmhouse standing alone beneath dark skies. To a family whose future was about to be stolen. And to a mystery that remains unresolved more than 50 years later. Because somewhere in the silence of that June night lies the answer. An answer hidden behind missing pieces, conflicting stories, and decades of unanswered questions. An answer that transformed an ordinary farming community into the setting of one of New Zealand's most enduring true crime mysteries. This is the story of the Crew murders. A story of death. A story of suspicion. A story of a nation searching for the truth. And a story that begins, as many of the darkest stories do, in a place that seemed impossibly peaceful before everything changed. Pukekohe in 1970 was the kind of place that rarely appeared on a map unless someone was specifically looking for it. Tucked into the rural landscape of New Zealand's North Island, it was a community shaped by farmland, long gravel roads, and the steady rhythm of agricultural life. The hills rolled gently beneath vast skies, and on clear mornings the countryside seemed to stretch forever. There were no crowds, no city lights, and no sense of urgency. Life moved according to seasons rather than clocks. Winter had arrived by June, bringing cold winds across the paddocks and covering the countryside in a muted palette of grey and green. The mornings began with frost clinging to fences and grass. Thin layers of mist often lingered over low fields before the sun slowly burned them away. Farmers rose before daylight, pulling on heavy jackets and boots before stepping into the cold. Their days were long, repetitive, and demanding, yet predictable. Predictability was part of what made rural communities feel safe. People knew one another. Families had often lived in the same districts for generations. Neighbors recognized vehicles passing along country roads. A stranger could easily stand out. If something unusual happened, word typically traveled fast. Yet beneath that sense of familiarity existed another reality. In isolated farming communities, distance could also hide secrets. The nearest neighbor might be hundreds of meters away. A scream might disappear into the wind. A light turning on in the middle of the night could go unnoticed. And once darkness settled over the countryside, entire homes seemed to vanish into blackness. The Crew family lived within this world. Their farmhouse stood among the farmland of Pukekawa, surrounded by the quiet beauty and isolation that defined rural New Zealand. To visitors, it appeared ordinary. There was nothing about the property that suggested it would one day become one of the most infamous crime scenes in the nation's history. It was simply home. The roads leading to the property wound through open countryside. Fence lines divided fields into neat sections. Trees bent slightly beneath the persistent winds of winter. On rainy days, mud collected along driveways and tracks. During the evenings, the distant sounds of livestock often carried across the landscape. It was a life many people dreamed of. Simple. Honest. Far removed from the problems of urban life. But reality is often more complicated than appearances suggest. The New Zealand of 1970 was experiencing social change. While rural communities maintained traditional values, the country itself was evolving. Economic pressures affected farming families. Expectations regarding marriage, family roles, and community reputation remained strong. People paid attention to how others lived. Rumors spread quietly but efficiently. Reputation mattered. In small communities, personal conflicts rarely remained entirely private. Arguments became topics of conversation. Relationships were observed. Disagreements were remembered. Most of the time, these tensions never escalated beyond gossip. Most of the time, the atmosphere of Pukekawa reflected a world that modern audiences may find difficult to imagine. There were no mobile phones. No social media updates. No surveillance cameras watching roads and intersections. If someone disappeared, days might pass before concerns grew serious. Communication depended on landline telephones, letters, and face-to-face conversations. Investigators in 1970 relied heavily on witnesses. They needed people to remember details, to recall vehicles, to notice strangers, to reconstruct timelines from memory alone. This limitation would later become critically important. Because when the tragedy unfolded, many of the answers detectives desperately needed simply did not exist. No video recordings. No digital footprints. No electronic records showing where people had been. Only fragments. Only memories. Only uncertainty. The countryside itself seemed almost timeless. On winter evenings, smoke drifted from chimneys into the cold air. Families gathered around dinner tables. Radios provided news and entertainment. Children played indoors as darkness settled outside. By modern standards, life felt slower. Perhaps that was why the coming events felt so shocking. Violence belonged somewhere else. At least that was what many people believed. Murder was something that happened in newspapers. In distant cities. Not here. Not among farms and quiet roads. Not among people who greeted one another by name. That belief created a sense of collective security. The idea that everyone belonged. The idea that danger would be visible before it arrived. The idea that evil announced itself. The Crew case would challenge every one of those assumptions. As investigators and journalists later examined the circumstances surrounding the murders, they repeatedly returned to the same question. How could something so brutal occur in a place that seemed so peaceful? The answer may lie in a truth that exists in every community, no matter how small. People rarely see the full lives of those around them. They see appearances, smiles, conversations, daily routines. But private struggles remain hidden behind closed doors. The landscape of Pukekawa contributed to this hidden world. A farmhouse could sit alone among acres of land. Its occupants might go hours without seeing another person. At night, darkness transformed isolation into vulnerability. Roads became empty. Fields became shadows. Distances felt larger. The environment itself created opportunities for secrecy. For someone approaching a property after dark, there were countless places to remain unseen. Countless places to wait. Countless places where the night could conceal intentions. Winter intensified these conditions. The weather often pushed people indoors. Rain swept across the countryside without warning. Winds rattled windows and shook trees. Visibility could become limited, especially after sunset. Imagine standing outside on one of those nights. Cold air filling your lungs. Moisture hanging in the darkness. The faint smell of wet earth. A distant light glowing from a farmhouse window. Nothing appears threatening. Nothing suggests violence. Yet history reminds us that danger often exists alongside ordinary life. The setting of this story matters because it shaped everything that followed. It influenced the investigation. It influenced witness testimony. It influenced public perception. And it continues to influence how the case is remembered today. The physical isolation of the Crew property meant that events occurring inside the farmhouse could remain hidden for precious hours or even days. The rural environment complicated searches. Weather affected evidence. Distances delayed discoveries. Every aspect of the landscape became part of the mystery. The people living in Pukekawa could not know that their community was approaching a moment that would define it for generations. At the time, it was simply another winter. Another farming season. Another collection of ordinary days. Children continued attending school. Farmers continued tending livestock. Families continued planning for the future. No one realized they were standing at the edge of a story that would eventually reach courtrooms, newspapers, government inquiries, and history books. The contrast between the setting and the crime remains one of the most haunting elements of the case. When people imagine murder, they often picture chaos. They picture obvious danger. They picture warning signs. But the setting of Pukekawa offered none of those things. Instead, it presented calm, beauty, routine. The illusion that tomorrow would be much like today. That illusion would soon be shattered. The fields would remain. The roads would remain. The winter winds would continue moving across the hills. But after June 1970, the community would never look at them quite the same way again. Because every familiar landmark would become connected to questions. Questions about what happened. Questions about who was responsible. Questions that, decades later, still linger across the countryside. And as the investigation unfolded, the peaceful landscape that once symbolized safety would become the backdrop for one of New Zealand's most enduring mysteries. A mystery rooted in a place that seemed too quiet for violence. Too ordinary for tragedy. And yet, as history would reveal, the darkness that descended upon the Crew family did not arrive from some distant world. It emerged from within the same countryside where people worked, lived, trusted, and believed they knew one another. That is what makes the setting of this case so important. Because before there was a murder, before there was suspicion, before there were accusations and controversy, there was simply Pukekawa. Cold. Silent. Beautiful. And completely unaware that it was about to become the center of a mystery that would endure for generations. Before they became names in newspaper headlines, before detectives studied photographs of their home and lawyers argued over evidence in crowded courtrooms, Harvey and Jeanette Crew were simply two people trying to build a future. That is often the tragedy hidden beneath true crime stories. History remembers the crime. The victims remember the life that existed before it. In the years before the winter of 1970, Harvey and Jeanette lived much like countless young couples scattered across rural New Zealand. They had hopes that stretched beyond the boundaries of their property. They worried about finances, about work, about family responsibilities. They made plans for tomorrow because they assumed tomorrow would come. Neither of them knew that the life they were building together would one day become frozen in time. Harvey Crew belonged to the land in a way only farmers truly understand. The countryside was not simply where he lived. It was how he measured life. The changing seasons determined routines. Weather forecasts mattered. Rain could mean opportunity or disaster. A cold winter could affect livestock. A dry summer could threaten months of work. Farming demanded patience. It demanded resilience. It demanded the ability to continue working even when conditions were difficult. Those who knew Harvey often described him as practical and hardworking. He was not the kind of man who sought attention. Like many farmers of his generation, he understood responsibility as something demonstrated through actions rather than words. Every morning began with work waiting to be done. Animals needed care. Equipment required maintenance. The farm demanded constant attention. The rhythm of rural life left little room for laziness. For Harvey, that rhythm became part of his identity. Meanwhile, Jeanette brought a different energy into the household. Young, intelligent, and ambitious, she possessed qualities that drew people toward her. She was often described as attractive and vibrant, someone whose presence naturally filled a room. Yet beneath that outward confidence existed the challenges faced by many young women living in isolated rural communities during that era. The reality of farm life could be lonely. Days often passed with limited social interaction. Distances separated friends and family. Responsibilities inside the home could feel endless. From the outside, the image of rural domestic life appeared peaceful. The reality was often more complicated. A farmhouse could become both a sanctuary and a prison depending on the circumstances. Jeanette was a mother as well as a wife. At the center of her world stood a little girl named Rochelle. The child represented possibility. The future. A reminder that the struggles of the present existed for a reason. Like many young mothers, Jeanette's days revolved around routines that seemed ordinary at the time. Feeding schedules. Laundry. Meals. The countless small responsibilities that quietly fill every day of parenthood. Those moments rarely appear in historical records. Investigators do not document bedtime stories. Courtrooms do not discuss laughter at the dinner table. Newspapers rarely describe the ordinary happiness found in a family meal. Yet those details matter. Because they remind us that victims were living human beings long before they became part of a criminal investigation. The Crew household existed within the realities of marriage, parenthood, and financial pressure. Farming was not an easy path toward prosperity. Every decision carried consequences. Expenses accumulated. Unexpected setbacks occurred. Success often depended on factors beyond anyone's control. Weather. Markets. Luck. The future always remained uncertain. For young couples attempting to establish themselves, those pressures could become significant. And like every marriage, the relationship between Harvey and Jeanette contained complexities invisible to outsiders. One of the recurring themes that emerged after the murders was the question of how well anyone truly understood their private lives. Friends saw certain aspects. Family members saw others. Neighbors observed from a distance. But no outsider experiences a marriage from the inside. Every relationship contains conversations nobody else hears. Disagreements nobody witnesses. Dreams discussed late at night after everyone else has gone home. Private fears. Private hopes. Private frustrations. The challenge for investigators would later be separating reality from perception. After a tragedy, people often reconstruct memories through the lens of what happened afterward. Ordinary events suddenly appear significant. Casual remarks become potential clues. Minor disagreements are interpreted as warning signs. The past begins to look different. Yet before the murders, Harvey and Jeanette appeared to many people as a young family building a life together. Their daughter transformed the household. Children often do. A home begins to revolve around them. Future plans become linked to them. Every sacrifice gains additional meaning because it serves a larger purpose. For Rochelle, her parents represented safety, comfort, protection, the certainty that someone would always be there. She was too young to understand how fragile that certainty truly was. As winter approached in 1970, life continued much as it always had. The farm required attention. Bills needed paying. Meals needed preparing. The ordinary machinery of daily existence moved forward one day at a time. Nothing about those routines suggested they were approaching an ending. That is one of the cruelest aspects of violent crime. Victims do not know they are living through their final ordinary day. The last breakfast feels like every other breakfast. The last conversation sounds completely normal. The final evening arrives without announcing itself. Somewhere within the final weeks of their lives, Harvey and Jeanette experienced moments they believed would be followed by countless more. Plans were made. Thoughts wandered toward the future. Perhaps they discussed improvements to the farm. Perhaps they talked about Rochelle. Perhaps they worried about expenses or weather or work. The details are lost to history. What remains is the knowledge that they were living. Not existing as future victims. Living. The image becomes even more heartbreaking when viewed through the perspective of their daughter. Rochelle would grow up surrounded by questions. Questions that nobody could fully answer. Questions that began before she was old enough to form lasting memories. Most people inherit stories from their parents. She inherited a mystery. Most children grow up hearing family memories directly from the people who created them. She would not have that opportunity. The murders stole more than 2 lives. They stole an entire future. Birthdays that would never be celebrated together. Conversations that would never happen. Milestones that would never be witnessed. Advice that would never be given. Love that would never be expressed. These losses are impossible to measure. Investigators count evidence. Families count absences. As later generations examined the case, many became fascinated by theories, suspects, and legal controversies. Those elements certainly matter. Yet they can sometimes overshadow the central tragedy. At the heart of the mystery stood 2 human beings whose lives ended violently and unexpectedly. A husband. A wife. Parents. Members of a community. People whose futures disappeared in a single night. The years have transformed them into historical figures, but in 1970 they were simply young adults facing the same uncertainties experienced by countless families. They worried about practical concerns. They made everyday decisions. They imagined a future extending decades ahead. They could not know that history had already begun moving toward them. There is something haunting about looking at photographs of victims before a crime occurs. The camera captures a moment untouched by what comes later. A smile. A glance. A posture. The people in those images remain unaware of the darkness waiting ahead. Harvey and Jeanette existed in that same unknowing space. When those photographs were taken, murder was not part of the story. Neither were investigations. Neither were courtroom battles. Neither were national controversies. There was only life. Ordinary, imperfect, precious life. the significance of their story does not come solely from how they died. It comes from how they lived. Because every unanswered question surrounding the case ultimately traces back to them. Every theory, every accusation, every legal argument, every investigation, all of it exists because two people lost everything. And as the winter of 1970 deepened across the farmland of Pukekohe, Harvey and Jeanette continued moving through their routines, unaware that they were approaching the final chapter of their lives. The fields outside remained quiet. The roads remained empty. The farmhouse remained standing beneath the cold New Zealand sky. Inside that home lived a family that still believed in tomorrow. A family that could not see the darkness approaching through the winter night. A family whose story was about to become one of the most enduring mysteries in New Zealand history. And when that darkness finally arrived, it would leave behind far more than a crime scene. It would leave behind a child, a grieving community, a divided nation, and questions that would survive for generations. The final day began like countless others. That simple fact makes what happened afterward feel even more disturbing. There was no public warning. No dramatic confrontation witnessed by neighbors. No flashing signal that violence was about to erupt inside the quiet farmhouse standing among the winter fields of Pukekohe. The morning arrived cold and grey. Low clouds drifted over the countryside. Moisture hung in the air. The landscape appeared muted beneath the pale light of a New Zealand winter. Farmers across the district began their routines as they always did. Gates were opened. Livestock were checked. Vehicles moved along narrow rural roads. Life continued. Somewhere within that ordinary rhythm, Harvey and Jeanette Crew moved through another day together. The exact details of their final hours have never been fully reconstructed. That uncertainty has haunted the case from the beginning. Investigators would later spend years attempting to understand what happened inside the farmhouse during those crucial hours. They would analyze evidence, compare statements, and examine countless theories. Yet the most important witnesses never lived to tell their story. What remains is a puzzle assembled from fragments. A timeline with missing pieces. A narrative interrupted by violence. As daylight faded across the countryside, temperatures dropped. Winter evenings arrived quickly in rural New Zealand. Shadows stretched across paddocks. The roads became darker. Lights appeared in farmhouse windows scattered across the landscape. Families settled indoors. The outside world gradually disappeared into darkness. At some point during that evening, the Crew household entered the final chapter of its existence as an ordinary family home. Inside were a husband and wife. Nearby was their young daughter, Rochelle. A child too young to understand the danger approaching. Too young to remember the events that would forever alter her life. The farmhouse itself was isolated enough that what happened inside could remain hidden from the outside world. That isolation had always been part of rural life. Most of the time, it provided peace. On this night, it provided opportunity. One of the most unsettling questions in the entire case is whether the killer arrived as a stranger or as someone familiar. Did Harvey and Jeanette know the person standing before them? Did they recognize a face? A voice? A vehicle approaching the property? Or did danger arrive unexpectedly from the darkness? The truth remains hidden somewhere beyond the reach of history. Investigators later concluded that both Harvey and Jeanette had been shot. That much is known. But the moments leading up to the killings remain obscured by time. Imagine the farmhouse during those final hours. A light glowing through a window. The ordinary sounds of domestic life. Perhaps a conversation at the kitchen table. Perhaps discussion of work that needed to be done the following day. Perhaps plans involving their daughter. The future still existed in those moments. The next morning still seemed certain. Then something changed. Whether it began with a knock at the door, an unexpected arrival, or a confrontation that developed inside the house, nobody can say with certainty. The available evidence suggests violence erupted within the home. Blood would later be discovered there. That detail alone paints a chilling picture. Because blood inside a family home transforms familiar spaces into something terrifying. A living room becomes a crime scene. A hallway becomes evidence. A home becomes the location of a final struggle. The farmhouse was no longer simply a place where a family lived. It had become the setting for murder. What happened next reveals a level of determination that would complicate the investigation for decades. The killings were not the end of the crime. They were only the beginning. At some point after Harvey and Jeanette were shot, their bodies were removed from the property. That decision required effort, time, planning. It transformed the crime from a spontaneous act of violence into something more calculated. Whoever committed the murders did not simply leave. Instead, actions were taken to conceal what had happened, to delay discovery, to erase the truth. Outside, the countryside remained silent. The darkness concealed movements that would never be fully explained. Roads stretched across the landscape beneath the winter sky. Fields stood empty. No witnesses emerged to provide a complete account. No one stepped forward with the missing piece that could solve the mystery. The killer moved through the night unseen. And perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of all remained inside the house. Rochelle. The child survived. While her parents disappeared, she remained behind. That fact continues to shock people more than 50 years later. A little girl left alone in a house touched by violence. Too young to call for help. Too young to understand why no one was coming. The image is devastating. History often focuses on investigations and suspects. But in those quiet hours after the murders, there was simply a child waiting for parents who would never return. No courtroom testimony can fully capture that tragedy. No forensic report can adequately describe it. The human cost becomes impossible to ignore. As the night continued, the distance between appearance and reality grew wider. To the outside world, nothing seemed unusual. The farmhouse still stood. The fields remained unchanged. The roads were empty. Yet inside the boundaries of that property, a catastrophe had already occurred. The following hours allowed the mystery to deepen. Every minute that passed increased the killer's advantage. Evidence could disappear. Memories could fade. Timelines could become uncertain. The concealment of the bodies ensured that investigators would begin their search without understanding the full scope of the crime. That decision proved crucial. A murder investigation functions differently when victims are immediately discovered. In this case, uncertainty came first. Questions came first. The truth remained hidden. The removal of the bodies introduced an additional layer of complexity that investigators would struggle to overcome. Why take such a risk? Why transport the victims? Why not simply leave the scene? Those questions generated endless speculation. Some believed the act suggested familiarity with the property. Others believed it reflected panic after the killings. Still others saw evidence of premeditation. Decades later, the answers remain elusive. The darkness of that winter night swallowed every explanation. There is another reason the events of that evening remain so haunting. The crime appears to have unfolded within an environment of trust. Whether the victims knew their killer or not, there were no obvious signs of forced chaos visible to the outside world. No immediate alarm spread through the community. No witness reported hearing a dramatic disturbance that instantly exposed the crime. Instead, violence emerged quietly and then disappeared into silence. That silence became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The silence inside the farmhouse after the gunshots. The silence surrounding the removal of the bodies. The silence that lingered while investigators searched for answers. The silence that continues more than half a century later. Because the most important voice remains absent. The voice of the killer. The individual responsible has never provided a confession. never explained a motive, never revealed what truly happened during those final hours. As a result, every reconstruction contains uncertainty. Every timeline contains gaps. Every theory contains unanswered questions. What can be said with confidence is that a young family was destroyed. A husband and wife lost their lives. A child lost both parents. And a peaceful farming district lost its sense of security. By the time dawn arrived over Pukekawa, the crime itself was already over. The fields looked much as they had the previous morning. Cold air drifted across the countryside. The winter landscape remained indifferent. Nature offered no clues. The roads offered no answers. The farmhouse concealed its secrets. Yet beneath the surface of that ordinary morning, the consequences had already begun. A murderer was somewhere beyond the horizon. 2 victims were gone. A child had been left behind. And an investigation that would become one of the most controversial in New Zealand history was quietly moving toward its beginning. No one knew it yet. But the mystery had already taken shape. A mystery built from blood, silence, and absence. A mystery that would consume detectives, divide public opinion, challenge the justice system, and survive for generations. The events of that winter night ended in darkness. The questions they created would endure far longer. The first sign that something was wrong did not arrive with flashing lights, police sirens, or a dramatic discovery. It arrived quietly. Like many mysteries, it began with absence. In rural communities, people often respect one another's privacy. Days can pass without direct contact. A missed conversation is rarely alarming. A delayed response to a phone call might mean someone is busy. A vehicle not seen on the road might simply be parked elsewhere. At first, there was no reason to imagine that a crime had occurred. No reason to suspect that a young family had already been torn apart. Yet somewhere beneath the surface of ordinary life, concern slowly began to grow. The farmhouse still stood where it always had. The fields surrounding it remained unchanged. The winter weather continued moving across the landscape. But something about the situation no longer felt normal. The silence had become too long. The absence had become too noticeable. The routine had been broken. And when routine breaks in a small community, people notice. The process of discovery in the Crew case did not happen all at once. Instead, it unfolded in layers, each revelation more disturbing than the one before it. The first people approaching the property could not have anticipated what they were about to encounter. From a distance, everything appeared ordinary. There were no obvious signs of catastrophe. No visible destruction. No indication that violence had taken place behind the walls of the house. That illusion vanished the moment someone stepped closer. A home has a feeling when it is lived in. There are sounds. Movement. Evidence of presence. The small signs that indicate normal life is continuing. When those signs disappear unexpectedly, the absence becomes impossible to ignore. As concern deepened, attention turned toward the farmhouse itself. Questions began to emerge. Where were Harvey and Jeanette? Why had no one heard from them? Why did circumstances feel increasingly unusual? The answers waiting inside the house would only deepen the mystery. One of the most heartbreaking discoveries involved Rochelle. The young child was found alive. Days had passed. Her parents were nowhere to be found. Yet somehow she had survived. That fact stunned everyone connected to the case. Even decades later, it remains one of the most emotionally devastating aspects of the story. The image is difficult to forget. A toddler alone inside a house. Too young to understand what had happened. Too young to explain anything investigators needed to know. The contrast was almost unbearable. A child still living. 2 parents missing. An entire household suspended in uncertainty. For investigators, Rochelle's survival confirmed that something was terribly wrong. Children that young do not simply remain alone for extended periods under normal circumstances. Her presence transformed concern into alarm. Now the search for answers became urgent. As authorities examined the property, evidence of violence began to emerge. Blood. Not enough to immediately explain everything, but enough to suggest that whatever had happened inside the house was serious. Very serious. Blood changes the nature of an investigation instantly. A missing person inquiry becomes something darker. Possibilities narrow. Fear grows. Investigators begin asking different questions. The farmhouse itself became a silent witness. Every room held potential clues. Every object became significant. Every stain, mark, and disturbance carried possible meaning. Detectives moved carefully through the property, attempting to reconstruct events that had already slipped beyond direct observation. The challenge was enormous. The victims were gone. The crime scene was incomplete. And valuable time had already passed. Those lost hours mattered. Crime scenes are fragile. Evidence disappears. Weather interferes. Human activity alters details. Memories become less reliable. The delay between the murders and their discovery created obstacles that would affect the investigation for years. Yet despite those limitations, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to avoid. This was not a voluntary disappearance. Harvey and Jeanette had not simply decided to leave. Something violent had happened inside their home. The blood pointed toward that reality. The absence of the couple reinforced it. And the presence of their abandoned child made it impossible to dismiss. As news spread throughout the community, disbelief quickly gave way to fear. Pukekawa was not accustomed to mysteries of this magnitude. People knew one another. Families had shared roads, schools, churches, and social gatherings for years. The possibility that a double murder had occurred among them felt almost unreal. Conversations changed. Voices lowered. Speculation began. Who could have done this? Why? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Meanwhile, investigators faced another troubling problem. There were no bodies. The absence of Harvey and Jeanette complicated everything. Without victims, detectives could not establish a complete timeline. Without victims, determining the precise circumstances of death became more difficult. Without victims, uncertainty remained. The search expanded. Authorities looked beyond the farmhouse. Roads were examined. Nearby areas were considered. Potential locations were investigated. Every possibility demanded attention. Yet for a time, the central mystery remained unsolved. The victims had vanished. The crime scene offered fragments. The truth remained hidden. Then came another discovery. One that confirmed the worst fears. Weeks after the disappearance, bodies were recovered from the Waikato River. The river itself stretched through the landscape with a deceptive calmness. Water moved steadily along its course, indifferent to the tragedy concealed within it. For weeks, it had carried secrets. Now those secrets were beginning to surface. The recovery of Harvey and Jeanette transformed the case completely. The uncertainty surrounding their fate ended. The murder investigation officially began. Yet even this crucial discovery created new questions. The bodies had not remained at the farmhouse. Someone had transported them. Someone had taken deliberate steps to conceal the crime. That realization introduced an entirely new dimension to the investigation. Murder was one thing. The removal and disposal of bodies suggested planning. Purpose. An effort to delay discovery. Investigators now faced a more complex offender than they had initially imagined. The killer had not simply acted. The killer had continued acting after the murders. The river recovery also provided forensic opportunities that had previously been unavailable. Examinations could finally determine causes of death. Timelines could be refined. Evidence could be analyzed. Every detail mattered. Every observation carried potential significance. Yet despite these advances, certainty remained frustratingly elusive. Some questions received answers. Others became even more confusing. This pattern would continue throughout the entire case. Each breakthrough seemed to reveal another layer of mystery. Back at the farmhouse, investigators worked tirelessly to connect physical evidence with a coherent sequence of events. Bloodstains suggested violence. The missing bodies confirmed homicide. The abandoned child established that something catastrophic had occurred inside the home. But the identity of the offender remained unknown. The crime scene itself offered no simple solution. No obvious confession. No straightforward trail leading directly to a suspect. Instead, detectives found themselves navigating a maze of possibilities. As media coverage intensified, public fascination grew. The combination of factors seemed almost impossible to ignore. A young farming couple murdered. A child left behind. Bodies hidden in a river. A rural community struggling to understand what had happened. The story possessed all the elements of a nightmare. Yet for the people closest to the victims, it was not a story. It was reality. Family members confronted grief while lacking answers. Friends struggled to reconcile the crime with the people they thought they knew. The community searched for reassurance that never fully arrived. Because if something like this could happen here, where could it not happen? That question lingered over Pukekohe like the winter clouds hanging above the farmland. The discovery phase of the investigation established the foundation for everything that followed. It revealed the brutality of the crime. It exposed the calculated effort to conceal it. And it introduced the central mystery that would endure for generations. Who killed Harvey and Jeanette Crew? The blood inside the house could not answer. The river could not answer. The recovered bodies could not answer. Every piece of evidence pointed toward murder. None pointed clearly toward a murderer. That uncertainty created a vacuum. And whenever a vacuum exists inside a major criminal investigation, theories rush in to fill the space. Suspicions emerged. Rumors circulated. Names began appearing in conversations. Some individuals attracted more attention than others. Detectives reviewed relationships, conflicts, movements, and opportunities. The search for a suspect had begun. What nobody realized at the time was that the investigation itself would eventually become almost as controversial as the murders. The evidence discovered at the farmhouse would be debated. The conclusions drawn by authorities would face scrutiny. And one of the most shocking chapters of the entire story was still waiting to unfold. For now, however, investigators stood at the beginning of a long and uncertain road. They had a crime scene. They had victims. They had a community desperate for answers. But they still did not have the one thing that mattered most. The truth. Every major murder investigation reaches a moment when the evidence stops speaking clearly. The initial shock fades. The crime scene has been processed. Witnesses have been interviewed. The victim's final movements have been examined. And investigators find themselves standing before a widening field of possibilities. That was exactly where the Crew investigation now found itself. Harvey and Jeanette were dead. Their bodies had been recovered. Evidence of violence had been found within the farmhouse. A child had been left behind. Yet despite the enormity of the crime, the identity of the killer remained frustratingly out of reach. For detectives, uncertainty is dangerous. The longer a case remains unsolved, the greater the pressure becomes. Families demand answers. Communities demand reassurance. The media demands progress. Every passing day increases expectations. Every unanswered question becomes another weight pressing down on investigators. The pressure surrounding the Crew murders was immense. This was not merely a local tragedy anymore. The case had captured public attention across New Zealand. People wanted an explanation. They wanted a face attached to the horror. They wanted to believe the killer could be identified and removed from society. The alternative was far more frightening. The alternative meant that somewhere, an unknown murderer continued living an ordinary life. Perhaps working. Perhaps socializing. Perhaps watching news reports about the investigation. Perhaps standing among the very people searching for answers. Detectives began examining every aspect of Harvey and Jeanette's lives. Friends were interviewed. Family members were questioned. Neighbors became subjects of scrutiny. Relationships were analyzed. Conflicts were explored. Financial circumstances were reviewed. Nothing was considered too small. No possibility was ignored. The process was exhaustive and often frustrating. Many leads appeared promising at first, then collapsed under closer examination. Witnesses remembered details that later proved unreliable. Rumors circulated through the community, generating suspicion but little evidence. Stories changed. Timelines shifted. The investigation advanced in one direction only to discover another dead end. This pattern repeated itself again and again. As weeks turned into months, detectives faced a difficult reality. The case was not solving itself. No dramatic confession had emerged. No undeniable piece of evidence had suddenly identified the killer. Instead, investigators found themselves navigating uncertainty. In that environment, attention inevitably began focusing on people closest to the victims. Statistically, many murders are committed by individuals familiar with those they kill. Investigators understood this. Therefore, they looked carefully at those within the victim's social circle. The closer someone stood to the center of the story, the more attention they received. One name eventually rose above the others. Arthur Allen Thomas. A neighboring farmer. A man who lived within the same rural community. A man whose life was about to become inseparably connected to one of New Zealand's most controversial criminal cases. At first glance, Thomas did not fit the image many people imagine when they think of a murderer. He was part of the community. A local farmer. Someone familiar rather than mysterious. Yet familiarity can quickly transform into suspicion during a murder investigation. Detectives began examining him more closely. His movements. His statements. His relationship to those involved. Every detail became important. Every inconsistency attracted attention. Every coincidence acquired potential significance. As investigators narrowed their focus, public attention followed. The psychological effect of becoming a suspect in a major murder investigation is difficult to imagine. Suddenly, ordinary actions are viewed differently. Conversations are analyzed. Personal history is scrutinized. Neighbors begin looking at you through a different lens. The presumption of innocence may exist in law, but public opinion often operates according to different rules. Suspicion itself carries enormous power. The atmosphere surrounding the investigation grew increasingly intense. Newspapers reported developments. Communities discussed theories. Speculation spread beyond Pukekohe into the wider country. People wanted certainty. But certainty remained elusive. One of the most dangerous aspects of high-profile investigations is the temptation to transform uncertainty into conclusions. Human beings dislike unanswered questions. We seek patterns. We seek explanations. We seek closure. When evidence appears incomplete, assumptions often rush in to fill the gaps. The Crew case became fertile ground for exactly that process. Various theories emerged regarding motive. Some focused on personal relationships. Others examined possible disputes. Still others suggested scenarios involving jealousy, resentment, or hidden conflicts. The problem was that theories are not evidence. A theory can sound convincing while still being wrong. Investigators needed proof. Something concrete. something capable of surviving scrutiny. As attention increasingly centered on Arthur Allen Thomas, detectives believed they were moving closer to solving the case. From their perspective, pieces of the puzzle appeared to be aligning. Evidence was collected. Statements were compared. A narrative began taking shape. For many observers, the direction of the investigation seemed logical. The public often assumes that police possess information unavailable to everyone else. That assumption creates trust. When authorities focus on a suspect, many people naturally believe there must be good reason. Yet history has repeatedly demonstrated that investigations can become vulnerable to tunnel vision. Once a particular theory gains momentum, contradictory information may receive less attention. Alternative possibilities may seem less attractive. The desire to solve a case can sometimes become stronger than the desire to question assumptions. Whether that happened here would become one of the central controversies of the entire story. But at this stage, those debates still belong to the future. For now, investigators continued building their case. Meanwhile, the emotional impact on the community deepened. The murders had already shattered a sense of security. Now suspicion introduced another form of damage. People began viewing one another differently. Trust weakened. Questions lingered. Who knew what? Who might be hiding something? Who could be believed? The social fabric of a small rural community can be surprisingly fragile when subjected to the strain of a major criminal investigation. Every conversation carries potential significance. Every rumor gains momentum. Every new development influences public perception. As months passed, the investigation consumed increasing amounts of time and attention. Resources were devoted to analyzing evidence. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Timelines were revisited. Authorities sought to transform suspicion into certainty. Yet beneath the surface, unresolved problems remained. Some questions refused to disappear. Some details resisted explanation. The case was moving forward, but not smoothly. Like many complex investigations, progress came with complications. Certain evidence generated debate. Certain interpretations depended heavily upon assumptions. And certain conclusions seemed stronger when viewed from one angle than another. Still, the momentum of the investigation continued. Eventually, authorities became convinced they had identified the person responsible. Arthur Allen Thomas was arrested. The announcement represented a turning point. For investigators, it suggested progress. For the victims' loved ones, it offered the possibility of justice. For the public, it provided an answer to the question that had dominated discussion for months. Or at least it appeared to provide an answer. Because the difference between a suspect and a killer is evidence. And evidence would soon become the most controversial aspect of the entire case. Thomas maintained his innocence. He denied responsibility. He rejected the accusations directed toward him. Such denials are common in criminal cases, and investigators often view them with skepticism. But history would eventually force New Zealand to ask a difficult question. What if he was telling the truth? At the time, however, few people could imagine where the case was heading. The public saw a suspect. Authorities saw a suspect. Many believed the investigation was approaching its conclusion. The reality was far more complicated. Because hidden beneath the surface of the case were flaws that had not yet been fully recognized. Flaws that would emerge slowly. Flaws that would shake confidence in the investigation itself. The irony is striking. The search for the killer had begun with uncertainty. As detectives worked to eliminate that uncertainty, they believed they were moving closer to justice. Instead, they were moving toward a controversy that would eventually become almost as famous as the murders themselves. Years later, legal experts, journalists, investigators, and ordinary citizens would continue debating what happened during this phase of the case. Did authorities identify the correct suspect? Did they become too focused on one theory? Did crucial mistakes occur? Or did something even more troubling take place? Those questions remained hidden for the moment. But they were already taking shape. The investigation had produced a suspect. What it had not yet produced was peace. Because while public attention increasingly focused on Arthur Allen Thomas, the central mystery remained unchanged. Harvey and Jeanette Crew were still dead. Their daughter still grew up without parents. The true events of that winter night remained obscured. And somewhere within the growing mountain of evidence, testimony, and speculation, the truth waited silently. Whether investigators had found it or lost it was a question nobody could yet answer. For years, it appeared that the story had already reached its conclusion. The murders had shocked New Zealand. Investigators had identified a suspect. The courts had spoken. Many people believed justice had been served. The public could finally place a name beside the crime and move forward. But some cases refuse to stay buried. Some cases continue whispering long after the verdict has been delivered. The Crew murders became one of those cases. Because even after Arthur Allen Thomas was convicted, something remained unsettled. Questions persisted. Doubt survived. And perhaps most importantly, Thomas himself never stopped insisting that he was innocent. There is a particular kind of determination often seen in prisoners who maintain their innocence. Some eventually abandon their appeals. Some accept defeat. Others continue fighting year after year, convinced that the truth will eventually emerge. Thomas belonged to the latter group. While many people assumed the case was closed, he continued challenging the conclusions that had destroyed his life. His conviction had not merely taken away his freedom. It had transformed his identity. To the public, he was now the man responsible for one of the most infamous murders in New Zealand history. The weight of that label was enormous. Yet he refused to accept it. At first, many people viewed his claims with skepticism. After all, convicted murderers frequently proclaim innocence. The justice system encounters such declarations every day. Why should this case be different? Why should anyone believe him? Those questions seemed reasonable. But over time, another question began to emerge. What if the evidence itself deserved closer examination? That possibility changed everything. As years passed, journalists, lawyers, supporters, and independent observers continued reviewing the case. The deeper some of them looked, the more uncomfortable they became. Certain details appeared unusual. Certain conclusions seemed less certain than they had once appeared. Certain pieces of evidence carried troubling implications. The confidence surrounding the original investigation began to crack. Only slightly at first. Then more visibly. And eventually, those cracks widened into something impossible to ignore. The turning point did not arrive in a dramatic instant. It emerged gradually through persistence. Through repeated examination. Through the willingness of individuals to revisit questions others considered settled. One of the most significant controversies centered around ballistic evidence. In many murder cases, forensic evidence carries tremendous persuasive power. Jurors often trust physical evidence because it appears objective. Unlike witnesses, bullets cannot forget. Unlike suspects, forensic evidence cannot lie. At least that is the assumption. The Crew case would challenge that belief in a profound way. As scrutiny intensified, concerns emerged regarding crucial evidence used to support the conviction. Questions were raised about cartridge cases connected to the investigation. How had they been discovered? When had they been discovered? And perhaps most importantly, could they be trusted? The implications were staggering. If key evidence was unreliable, then the entire foundation of the prosecution might be compromised. What initially appeared to be a technical issue soon evolved into something much larger. Something far more disturbing. Supporters of Thomas argued that evidence had not merely been misunderstood. They suggested something far more serious. The possibility that evidence had been planted. Few accusations strike at the heart of a justice system more directly than that. Mistakes can happen. Witnesses can be mistaken. Investigators can overlook important details. But deliberately planting evidence crosses into a completely different category. It transforms error into misconduct. It transforms investigation into manipulation. And it raises a terrifying possibility. What if the system responsible for finding the truth had actually helped bury it? The idea seemed almost unbelievable. Many people resisted it. Police institutions carried significant public trust. The suggestion that officers involved in a major murder case might have fabricated evidence was shocking. Yet the questions refused to disappear. Instead, they became louder, more persistent, more difficult to dismiss. As public concern grew, pressure mounted for a deeper examination of the case. What followed would become one of the most remarkable developments in New Zealand legal history. The case was no longer simply about who murdered Harvey and Jeanette Crew. Now it was also about the integrity of the investigation itself. Two mysteries had become intertwined. One involved the identity of the killer. The other involved the conduct of those searching for that killer. The distinction mattered enormously. Because if investigators had compromised evidence, then solving one mystery might have made the other even more difficult. Years of legal battles followed. Reviews. Appeals. Arguments. Challenges to official conclusions. Each new development forced the public to reconsider assumptions that once seemed secure. The confidence surrounding the conviction continued eroding. Slowly. Reluctantly. But unmistakably. The deeper authorities looked, the more troubling the picture became. Eventually, the controversy reached a level that could no longer be ignored. A formal inquiry was established. Its purpose was not simply to revisit old questions. Its purpose was to determine whether the justice system itself had failed. The inquiry represented a moment of reckoning. For years, people had argued. Now evidence would be examined once again. Witnesses would be scrutinized. Claims would be tested. The truth, if it could still be found, would face renewed examination. As investigators revisited the case, a chilling possibility emerged. The evidence that helped secure Thomas's conviction may never have belonged there in the first place. The allegation was explosive. Its consequences were even greater. Because if critical evidence had been planted, then the implications extended far beyond one man. Such a revelation would undermine confidence in the investigation. In the prosecution. In the verdict. Perhaps even in the institutions themselves. The inquiry's findings stunned the nation. After years of controversy and examination, conclusions emerged suggesting that evidence had indeed been fabricated. A cartridge case central to the prosecution's argument was determined to have been planted. The words landed like a shockwave. Everything changed. The narrative that had dominated public understanding for years suddenly collapsed. The convicted murderer now appeared less certain. The investigation appeared more questionable. The case that once seemed solved was no longer solved at all. For Arthur Allen Thomas, the implications were life-altering. The foundation supporting his conviction had been severely damaged. His claims of innocence, once dismissed by many, suddenly demanded reconsideration. The man long portrayed as a killer was now viewed through an entirely different lens. Not necessarily as proven innocent of every suspicion, but certainly as someone who may have been profoundly wronged. Public perception shifted. Not all at once. Not universally. But significantly. People who had once accepted the official story began asking difficult questions. How could this happen? Who was responsible? How had such a serious failure occurred? And perhaps most importantly, if Thomas was not the killer, then who was? The inquiry answered some questions while creating new ones. It exposed weaknesses. It revealed misconduct. It challenged assumptions. Yet it did not solve the murders. The central mystery survived. Harvey and Jeanette remained dead. Their killer remained unidentified. the truth surrounding the murders themselves remained frustratingly incomplete. That reality created a strange and unsettling outcome. The breakthrough that destroyed confidence in the conviction did not produce certainty regarding the crime. Instead, it reopened uncertainty. The case had traveled in a circle. Investigators began with questions. They believed they found answers. Years later, those answers dissolved. The questions returned. Perhaps even stronger than before. The emotional impact extended far beyond legal institutions. Families of the victims remained without closure. Supporters of Thomas felt vindicated yet frustrated. Members of the public struggled to understand how such a situation could occur. Trust had been damaged. And trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. The breakthrough represented both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph because serious concerns were finally acknowledged. A tragedy because those revelations exposed how far the case remained from resolution. The inquiry illuminated problems. It did not reveal the killer. The mystery endured. More than that, it evolved. Now the story included not only murder but controversy. Not only loss but institutional failure. Not only unanswered questions about a crime but unanswered questions about justice itself. By the end of this extraordinary chapter, one fact stood above all others. The conviction that once seemed to bring certainty no longer provided certainty at all. Instead, New Zealand found itself confronting a disturbing possibility. The wrong man may have been punished. The real killer may have escaped. And somewhere beneath decades of confusion, mistakes, accusations, and shattered assumptions, the truth remained hidden. Waiting. Silent. Unresolved. Just as it had been on that cold winter night in 1970. Courtrooms are often described as places where truth emerges. The reality is more complicated. A courtroom is not a machine that automatically produces justice. It is a stage upon which competing narratives battle for acceptance. Lawyers present evidence. Witnesses offer testimony. Jurors evaluate what they hear. Judges oversee the process. Every participant enters believing that the system is capable of separating fact from fiction. Most of the time, society depends upon that belief. Without it, the entire structure begins to tremble. The Crewe murder case would eventually force New Zealand to confront one of the most uncomfortable questions any justice system can face. What happens when a verdict itself becomes part of the mystery? For Arthur Allen Thomas, the courtroom represented both condemnation and hope. It was the place where his freedom had been taken. Years later, it would also become the place where the foundations of that judgment were challenged. The original trials carried enormous public interest. By that stage, the murders of Harvey and Jeanette Crewe had already become one of the most discussed criminal cases in the country. The public wanted certainty. The families wanted answers. The prosecution presented a narrative designed to explain the crime and identify the person responsible. Thomas stood at the center of that narrative. The image was powerful. A suspect from within the local community. A man investigators believed they could connect to the murders. Evidence was presented. Arguments were made. Jurors listened. When guilty verdicts were ultimately delivered, many observers felt a sense of relief. The nightmare finally appeared to have an ending. The killer had been found. Justice had been served. The story was over. At least that was what people believed at the time. Yet verdicts possess a unique vulnerability. They depend entirely upon the integrity of the evidence supporting them. A jury can only evaluate what is placed before it. A judge can only rule based upon available information. If that information is incomplete, misleading, or corrupted, the resulting verdict becomes vulnerable as well. That uncomfortable reality would eventually transform the entire case. Years after the conviction, legal battles continued. Appeals were filed. Questions persisted. Supporters of Thomas refused to abandon their campaign. They argued that the verdict should not be accepted as final. Many people viewed these efforts as futile. The justice system had already spoken. Why continue fighting? But persistence has a way of changing history. The longer the controversy survived, the more attention it attracted. The more attention it attracted, the more scrutiny the evidence received. And the more scrutiny the evidence received, the more troubling the situation appeared. The courtroom drama evolved beyond the traditional struggle between prosecution and defense. Now the conflict involved something larger. Public confidence. Institutional accountability. The legitimacy of the investigation itself. As concerns regarding evidence gained credibility, the legal system faced increasing pressure to respond. Eventually, official reviews and inquiries began examining aspects of the case that many once considered settled. The process was slow. Painfully slow. Years passed while arguments continued. Lives continued moving forward. Yet the shadow of the Crew murders remained. The case refused to disappear. Every new revelation reignited debate. Every unanswered question fueled public interest. And gradually, the focus shifted away from Thomas alone. People began examining the actions of investigators. The evidence itself became the subject of scrutiny. The spotlight moved. The implications were enormous. If investigators had made mistakes, that would be troubling. If investigators had acted improperly, that would be worse. If evidence had been deliberately manipulated, the consequences would be historic. The justice system found itself confronting possibilities that few had imagined during the original trials. Inside courtrooms and inquiry proceedings, legal arguments became increasingly complex. The issue was no longer simply whether Thomas had committed murder. The issue became whether the conviction could be trusted. That distinction changed everything. A person may appear guilty in public opinion. A conviction, however, requires confidence in the process that produced it. Without confidence in that process, certainty begins to crumble. As findings emerged suggesting serious problems with critical evidence, the foundation supporting the conviction weakened dramatically. The effect was profound. Imagine building a house upon what appears to be solid ground. For years, everyone trusts the structure. Then one day someone discovers cracks beneath the foundation. Suddenly every wall appears less stable. Every assumption requires re-examination. That was what happened here. The conviction itself became unstable. Questions that once seemed resolved returned with renewed force. The legal system now faced a challenge unlike any it had encountered before. How do you address a case in which the search for justice may itself have caused injustice? There are no easy answers. No simple procedures. Only difficult decisions. And difficult consequences. As official inquiries progressed, the conclusions reached regarding key evidence were devastating. The allegations of planted evidence were no longer dismissed as conspiracy theories or desperate claims. They had entered the realm of serious findings. The implications rippled outward. The original prosecution appeared compromised. The conviction appeared compromised. Public trust suffered. Many people felt shock. Others felt anger. Some felt vindication. For supporters of Thomas, years of persistence suddenly seemed justified. For defenders of the original investigation, the revelations were deeply troubling. For the broader public, the situation created uncertainty. Who should be believed? Which version of events was accurate? How could such a failure occur within a major murder investigation? The legal system eventually moved toward correcting what had occurred. Arthur Allen Thomas received a full pardon. The significance of that decision cannot be overstated. A pardon is more than a legal document. It is an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that something went wrong. An acknowledgement that the conviction should no longer stand. An acknowledgement that justice demands correction when serious failures are uncovered. For Thomas, the pardon represented a form of vindication. But even vindication carries limits. Years had already been lost. Reputations had already been damaged. Experiences cannot be undone. Time cannot be returned. The legal system could alter records. It could not erase history. Nor could it erase the murders themselves. That reality remained at the center of everything. Because while attention focused upon the conviction, Harvey and Jeanette Crew remained victims. The passage of time had not changed that fact. Their death still demanded answers. Their daughter still grew up without parents. The original tragedy remained unresolved. This created one of the most unusual outcomes in modern criminal history. The justice system corrected a wrongful conviction without solving the underlying crime. In many cases, overturning a conviction leads investigators toward the true offender. Not here. Instead, certainty disappeared altogether. The man once identified as the killer was no longer considered responsible. Yet no alternative suspect emerged with sufficient evidence to replace him. The mystery expanded once again. The legal proceedings had answered one question while leaving another untouched. Was Thomas guilty? The answer increasingly appeared to be no. Who murdered Harvey and Jeanette Crew? That question remained unanswered. The courtroom battles produced another legacy as well. They exposed the importance of accountability. Justice systems possess extraordinary power. They can imprison. They can destroy reputations. They can shape history. Because of that power, scrutiny becomes essential. The Crew case demonstrated what can happen when confidence in evidence is compromised. It became a cautionary tale studied by lawyers, investigators, journalists, and legal scholars. Not simply because of the murders, but because of everything that followed. The courtroom had originally appeared to deliver finality. Years later, it became the setting for reconsideration. The same institution that convicted Thomas ultimately participated in correcting that conviction. There is a strange symmetry in that process. A reminder that justice is not a destination reached once and forever. It is an ongoing responsibility. A system must remain willing to question itself. Must remain willing to revisit uncomfortable truths. Must remain willing to admit mistakes. Otherwise, justice becomes something else entirely. As the legal battles finally drew toward their conclusion, the emotional landscape remained complicated. No verdict could bring Harvey and Jeanette back. No pardon could restore the years Thomas lost. No inquiry could fully repair public confidence. The damage existed. Permanent. Visible. Part of history. Yet there was also value in the truth that emerged. Even delayed truth possesses power. Even imperfect justice matters. The exposure of wrongdoing prevented silence from becoming permanent. It forced a nation to confront uncomfortable realities. And it ensured that the case would be remembered for more than a murder alone. By the end of this extraordinary legal journey, one thing had become unmistakably clear. The story was never simply about a killer. It was also about the institutions tasked with finding that killer. About the responsibilities they carried. About the consequences when those responsibilities are betrayed. And about the enduring struggle to separate truth from certainty. Because certainty can be manufactured. Truth cannot. The courtroom had delivered its judgments. The inquiries had delivered their findings. The pardon had been granted. Yet when the legal dust finally settled, the central mystery remained standing exactly where it had begun. In a quiet farmhouse. On a cold winter night. With 2 victims. 1 surviving child. And a question that no courtroom had ever fully answered. More than half a century has passed since the winter night that changed everything. The roads of Pukekawa are still there. The fields still rise and fall across the landscape. The winds still move across the countryside just as they did in 1970. The seasons continue their endless cycle, indifferent to the tragedies of human lives. At first glance, time appears to have moved on. But some stories never truly belong to the past. Some stories remain suspended between memory and mystery. The Crew murders are one of them. When people discuss the case today, they often focus on the controversy, the wrongful conviction, the allegations of planted evidence, the legal battles, the public inquiries, the political consequences. Those elements deserve attention because they represent one of the most significant criminal justice controversies in New Zealand history. Yet beneath every debate lies a simpler truth. 2 people died. A child lost both parents. And the person responsible was never identified. That reality remains unchanged. No matter how many years pass. No matter how many books are written. No matter how many documentaries are produced. The central wound remains. In many true crime stories, audiences search for endings. Human beings naturally crave closure. We want mysteries solved. We want villains identified. We want justice delivered. Stories feel more comfortable when every question receives an answer. The Crew case offers no such comfort. Its legacy is built upon uncertainty. And uncertainty can be far more haunting than certainty. A known killer can be studied. A known motive can be analyzed. A solved crime can be placed within the past. An unsolved crime refuses to stay there. It continues generating questions. Continues provoking debate. Continues inviting new theories. Decades later, people still examine the evidence. Still revisit witness statements. Still speculate about suspects. Still search for the missing piece that might finally explain what happened. Perhaps that missing piece no longer exists. Perhaps it disappeared long ago. Lost to time. Lost to memory. Lost alongside opportunities that can never be recovered. That possibility may be one of the most difficult aspects of the entire story. Because some mysteries are not solved. Not because investigators stop trying. Not because people stop caring. But because time itself becomes an obstacle. Witnesses age. Memories fade. Evidence deteriorates. Those who possess secrets eventually die. And with them, answers disappear. The Crew murders exist within that uncomfortable reality. The farther history moves from 1970, the more difficult certainty becomes. Yet despite that challenge, the case continues to matter. Not only because of the murders themselves, but because of what the case reveals about human nature. About institutions. About truth. About justice. One of the most powerful lessons emerges from the story of Arthur Allen Thomas. Regardless of how people view every aspect of the case, the official findings regarding the conviction force New Zealand to confront a difficult truth. Justice systems are created by human beings. And human beings are imperfect. We often speak about institutions as though they possess independent identities. In reality, institutions are collections of people. People capable of extraordinary dedication. People capable of mistakes. People capable of bias. People capable of wrongdoing. The distinction matters. Because faith in justice should never mean blind faith. Accountability exists for a reason. Transparency exists for a reason. Scrutiny exists for a reason. The Crew case became a reminder that the pursuit of justice must remain as important as justice itself. A conviction alone cannot be the goal. The truth must be the goal. Without that commitment, the risk of error grows. And when error occurs within a murder investigation, the consequences extend far beyond courtrooms. Victims remain without answers. Families remain without closure. The innocent may suffer. The guilty may remain free. No outcome could be more destructive. There is another lesson hidden within this story. One that often receives less attention. The lesson concerns memory. When tragedies occur, public attention tends to focus upon dramatic moments. The murders. The arrests. The trials. the scandals. Yet memory asks something different of us. Memory asks us to remember the people behind the headlines. Harvey Crew. Jeanette Crew. A young couple attempting to build a life together. Their names deserve more than a place in legal history. They deserve recognition as human beings whose futures were stolen. It is easy for true crime stories to become dominated by killers and investigations. The victims sometimes fade into the background. The Crew case reminds us why that should never happen. Everything that followed began with their loss. Every inquiry, every appeal, every controversy, every debate, all of it traces back to one devastating fact. They never came home. And then there is Rochelle. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of the entire tragedy. A child who survived. A child who grew up in the shadow of questions she never asked to inherit. Imagine building your identity around an event you cannot remember. Imagine knowing that the defining moment of your life occurred before you were old enough to understand it. Imagine spending decades surrounded by theories, headlines, investigations, and controversies connected to your own family. That burden cannot be measured. The murders did not end in 1970. Their consequences continued through the years that followed. Through childhood. Through adulthood. Through generations. That is another reality often overlooked in discussions of violent crime. The crime itself may last minutes. Its impact can last lifetimes. As the decades passed, the Crew murders gradually transformed from current events into history. Yet history possesses a unique power. It allows societies to reflect upon themselves, to examine successes, to acknowledge failures, to ask difficult questions, and perhaps to learn. The case has become part of New Zealand's collective memory because it touches upon universal fears. The fear of violence. The fear of injustice. The fear that truth can disappear. But it also touches upon something else. Persistence. People continued asking questions. Continued seeking answers. Continued challenging assumptions. That persistence matters. Without it, many of the later revelations may never have emerged. Without it, uncomfortable truths may have remained hidden forever. The search for truth is often slow. Sometimes painfully slow. Sometimes frustratingly incomplete. Yet it remains necessary. Even when certainty proves impossible. Especially when certainty proves impossible. Today, the mystery remains officially unresolved. No definitive answer has emerged regarding who murdered Harvey and Jeanette Crew. No final revelation has closed the case. The identity of the killer remains hidden somewhere beyond the reach of available evidence. That fact may frustrate audiences seeking a traditional ending. But perhaps the absence of an ending is itself part of the story. Not every mystery is solved. Not every wound fully heals. Not every question receives an answer. The world is more complicated than that. And true crime, at its best, reminds us of those complications. It reminds us that justice can be fragile. That truth can be difficult to uncover. That certainty should be questioned. And that every victim deserves to be remembered as more than a chapter in an investigation. As we leave Pukekohe behind, the image that remains is not one of courtrooms or legal documents. It is something quieter. A farmhouse standing beneath a winter sky. A young family living ordinary lives. A future they believed would continue. And a darkness approaching that none of them could see. The years have passed. The landscape has changed. The headlines have faded. Yet the questions remain. Who walked into that farmhouse? Who ended 2 lives? Who left a child behind? Who carried those secrets into the darkness? Perhaps someone knew the answers once. Perhaps someone carried them for decades. Perhaps those answers vanished forever. We cannot know. What we do know is this. Harvey and Jeanette Crew deserve to be remembered. Not because of how they died, but because they lived. Because they mattered. Because behind every mystery are real human lives. And because the search for truth, even when incomplete, remains one of the most important responsibilities any society can undertake. The case remains open in history. The mystery remains unsolved. The silence remains unbroken. And somewhere within that silence, more than 50 years later, the final answer still waits. There is a moment in every long investigation when people begin to accept that the truth may never fully arrive. Not because they stop caring. Not because the case becomes unimportant. But because time slowly teaches a harsh lesson: some doors do not reopen, some answers do not return, and some crimes leave behind gaps that even decades of effort cannot close. The Crew murders reached that point long ago. Yet the story refuses to disappear. It remains alive in archives, in legal debates, in documentaries, in conversations that resurface every few years whenever someone new discovers what happened in that quiet corner of Pukekawa in 1970. The farmhouse is still gone from its original context now, absorbed into the passage of time, but the land itself remains. Fields that once held silence and winter mist still exist, carrying no visible memory of what unfolded there. And that is perhaps the most unsettling part. The ordinary appearance of the place never changed, even though everything that happened there changed everything else. History has a strange way of separating places from events. But human memory does not separate them so easily. For those who followed the case closely, the names Harvey and Jeanette Crew do not exist as abstract references. They remain anchored to a specific emotional weight, a sense of interrupted life, of futures that were never allowed to continue. Their story is not defined by the legal controversies that followed, although those controversies became inseparable from the public understanding of the case. At its core, the tragedy is still the same: 2 people gone, a child left behind, and a question that never found its final form. Over time, the case became something larger than itself. It became a reference point in discussions about criminal justice. A warning about certainty. A reminder that investigations, no matter how confident they appear, are still human processes shaped by perception, pressure, and interpretation. It also became a case study in how public belief forms. How quickly a suspect can become a certainty in the eyes of a community. How difficult it is to reverse that belief once it has taken hold. And how deeply people want closure, even when closure may not be justified by the evidence available. The later findings surrounding the investigation changed the way many people understood the system, but they did not change the fundamental absence at the center of the story. Even after convictions were questioned, even after legal decisions were revisited, even after official conclusions were challenged, one reality remained untouched. No one has ever been definitively proven to have committed the murders. That gap is the reason the case continues to be discussed. It is not simply a story about a wrongful conviction. It is not only a story about investigative controversy. It is, at its core, a story about unresolved violence. And unresolved violence has a way of lingering far beyond the moment it occurs. For Rochelle Crew, the passage of time carried a different meaning. While the world debated evidence, legal outcomes, and competing interpretations, she lived with a reality shaped by absence. Most people grow up with stories that connect them backward into family history. She grew up with a historical void at the center of her earliest life, a space filled by accounts she did not experience firsthand, shaped by interpretations rather than memory. That kind of inheritance is difficult to describe. It is not simply grief. It is not simply curiosity. It is a life built around an event that exists outside personal recollection but inside personal identity. Few cases in New Zealand history carry that kind of long shadow across a single life. As years turned into decades, the world moved forward. New generations learned about the case through condensed summaries rather than lived memory. The urgency faded, but interest remained. True crime audiences rediscovered it. Legal scholars revisited it. Journalists re-examined it. Each return brought new interpretations, but no final resolution. the story resisted closure in the same way it resisted certainty. There is a temptation in true crime storytelling to search for an ending that feels complete. A final revelation. A decisive answer. A name that resolves everything. But some cases do not offer that structure. Instead, they leave behind an open shape, defined not by what is known, but by what is missing. The Crew case is one of those shapes. A crime scene that no longer exists in its original form. Evidence that has been debated for generations. Legal outcomes that were revisited and reinterpreted. A suspect who was once condemned and later pardoned. And at the center of it all, two victims whose final moments remain unseen. There is a particular discomfort in stories like this. Not because they are sensational, but because they resist emotional resolution. They do not allow the audience to settle into comfort. They force the recognition that justice systems, despite their structure and intention, operate within human limits. And human limits are never perfect. Yet even within that discomfort, there is something important. The persistence of the case ensures that Harvey and Jeanette Crew are not forgotten. Their names continue to be spoken, analyzed, and remembered. Not as statistics, but as people whose lives mattered beyond the circumstances of their deaths. That memory is the only form of permanence available in cases like this. Everything else remains uncertain. And perhaps that is the final truth the story leaves behind. Not the identity of a killer. Not the resolution of legal debates. But the recognition that some truths remain out of reach, even when every available effort has been made to find them. The silence that surrounds the Crew murders is not empty. It is full of unanswered questions, unresolved histories, and human consequences that continue to echo through time. And as long as those questions remain, the case will not fully become history. It will remain something else. Something ongoing. Something unsettled. Something that continues to ask, across decades and generations, the same unbroken question that began in a winter farmhouse in 1970. What really happened there? And who, if anyone, will ever be able to say with certainty?